The first step in replacing the control arm bushings and ball joints is to jack up the front of the car and place it on jack stands. For additional assistance with those tasks, please follow the link provided at the end of this video. Next, remove the wheels and locate the outer ball joints. These are bolted up underneath the wheel carrier with two 13mm bolts and one large nut. Remove the large nut first, purple arrow, and then loosen and remove the two 13mm bolts, green arrows. This will give you a little more clearance to slide the ball joint removal tool over the control arm. Note, both brake discs and dust shield have been removed here for photographic purposes. Remove the nut and use a puller to separate the ball joint from the control arm. Use caution and take your time here. The joint is a tapered fit and many times the metal can fuse together. Now move underneath the car and remove the large nut securing the inner ball joint to the control arm. You may need to counterhold the ball joint with a hex key in order to loosen the nut. Now remove the front subframe from the car. Unfortunately, there is no way to access the rear control arm bracket bolts with the subframe in place. Please follow the link provided at the end of this video for subframe removal. With the subframe removed, you will have access to both the rear control arm bushing bracket bolts, green arrows, and also the inner control arm ball joint, purple arrows. This is also a good time to inspect the front sway bar bushings for wear. Once the bolts are removed, place the control arm in a vise and remove the rear bushing. In this image, you can see how the fluid-filled control arm bushing has failed. Over time, the repeated stress of up and down motion cracks the rubber unit until it can separate completely. If you see fluid leaking out of the bushing, then it's time to replace it. Take note of the arrow on the end of the bushing, green arrow, and make a mark on both the bushing bracket and the end of the control arm, purple lines. This will act as an orientation mark for you when you install the new bushings. Here is another shot of the failed bushing. In our case, we could simply pull the outer bracket off of the inner rubber sleeve. Now pry the old bushing off the control arm. I had good success using a silicone-based lubricant and a thick screwdriver. The factory manual specifies as using a puller to get it off, but I had no trouble with the screwdriver method. Now rotate the control arm so that you have access to the inner ball joint. BMW specifies the use of a special tool in order to press the ball joint out of the control arm. However, I had success removing one of the joints using a tie rod puller as shown here. For the other control arm, I had the use of a hydraulic press in order to remove the joint. This, in my opinion, is the hardest part of the whole job. Spraying some penetrating oil in around the joint connection certainly can't hurt either. Shown here is the control arm with the ball joint removed. It's a good idea to clean up any corrosion on the inside of the joint. Now place the new inner ball joint into the control arm and thread the new self-locking nut on loosely. Keep in mind that the left and right ball joints are different. Take note of the letter cast into the ball joint. This will tell you what side to replace. For the control arm bushings, you can either buy new brackets with the bushings pre-installed or just the bushings themselves. Typically, the price difference is low enough that you would just want to buy the bushings pre-installed. If you decide to use just the bushings, you will have to have the old bushings pressed out of the brackets as shown here. When you press the new bushing onto the bracket, make sure to line up the arrow on the new bushing so that it corresponds with the mark you made on the bracket earlier. Getting the new bushings bracket started on the control arms can be a bit of a challenge. BMW specifies the use of a specialized press tool, but I found that using a little silicone lubricant on the inside of the bushing, along with a quick, good blow with a hammer, managed to get the bushing on enough to where I could push it down all the way. Another option to consider while you have the control arms removed is to upgrade to a polyurethane control arm bushing. I would recommend running these bushings if you are running a stiffer suspension. These bushings are less compressible than stock rubber bushings and can deal with added stress much more easily. The bushings require that you press the existing bushings out of the bracket. Once the bushings have been removed, you will need to press the larger retaining bushing into the control arm bracket. The polyurethane bushings we use from Mini Madness are a 3-piece design. Slide the smaller spacing ring over the end of the control arm, with the step on the inside facing down. Next, slide the upper part of the bushing over the control arm. You will also want to place some grease on the channels on the bushing, green arrow. This will help lubricate the bushing and prevent squeaking. Now place the bracket with the black insert over the red bushing and fit the control arm to the subframe and retorque the bolts. Shown here is the bracket with the polyurethane bushing installed and the subframe being jacked up into place. Since the bushing is loaded on all sides once loaded into the bracket, you don't have to worry about aligning the bushings with the marks you made earlier. Place the new outer ball joint into the wheel housing and thread it in and torque the two 13mm bolts to spec, green arrows. Fit the control arm over the lower portion of the outer ball joint and fit the new self-locking nut to the bottom. Torque to spec, purple arrow. You may need to counterhold the ball joint with a hex key until the nut threads far enough to keep the joint from turning. As the nut tightens, the ball joint will stop turning due to the tapered design. Now move underneath the car and thread the new self-locking nut onto the inner ball joint where it mounts to the subframe. Torque that to spec. As before, you may need to counterhold the joint with a hex key. Shown here is one of the differences in the front control arm setup on the R55, 56, and 57 cars. As you can see here, the outer ball joint is now secured to the control arm rather than the steering knuckle. Remove the ball joint by first loosening the upper ball joint connection, yellow arrow. Use a control arm separator to free the joint from the steering knuckle and then unbolt the ball joint from the control arm by removing the two 17mm nuts shown, green arrows. Thanks for watching. Be sure to subscribe to our channel and check out another video in this series.